And by the way, all of you are going to get a recording of this after it's over. So you'll have this content to watch again and again. So Curt, over to you.
Thanks, Jay, and thanks to all those who sent questions in our for our first time. And there may have been others, and we hope that we're able to cover as many as we can after this next talk. The next talk is titled "Storytellers: From Mechanics to Meaning," and what we shared in the first hour together in our first 30 minutes were just what I like to call the mechanics of shame. But it's important to know that and if you were to read the clinical literature, you could read all about those things that I talked to you about, like just the nature of how shame operates and so forth. But it's important to know and to remember that shame isn't just a thing that happens to be in the universe. It has effect only because it takes place in the context of stories, only in the context of our own personal stories that we each have. But it's also important to know the nature of our stories in order for us to recognize that my story never is just about me. It is always a collaborative affair. And so in the same way, as we learn about God's story in the world, it's significant for us to recognize that God also understands shame, and that shame is taking place in the context of his story, in the story that God is telling about him and his people. And so with that in mind, I want us to move then from the mechanics of shame and how it operates, and how does that then end up having meaning, and the way that we make meaning of our lives is as storytellers. We human beings, as far as we know, I suppose, unless you find yourself in the middle of a C.S. Lewis novel, are the only animals that talk to each other in the way that we do. Now, we don't know. Maybe there are other animals that are having conversations, that they're even having conversations about us. They're just not telling us that they're doing this. But as far as we know, we are the only animals that tell stories in the way that we do. And there are some important ways in human development that storytelling emerges that are really helpful and significant for us to know. And so we're going to walk through some of those features, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the Bible as story, and how shame has tried to embed itself, how evil has tried to wield shame in the context of that story and in our story, and why paying attention to my story in all of its multiple detail is so important. Here's one of the first features of storytelling that we know that we have as human beings. The first is that your story was told about you. Your story began long before you were born. We already referenced Jeremiah chapter 1, that in some respects, in God's mind, your story has been around from the beginning. He's been thinking about your story for a long time, but he's not the only one. When your parents became pregnant with you, in whatever way that showed up, your parents began to tell a story about you, even though you were only a zygote at the time. They didn't even know if you were going to be a boy or a girl yet. Now, my parents were 44 and 45 when I was born. And in 1962, to be 44 when you're giving birth to your fourth son, as it turned out, like, that's not a common thing. Women were not having babies in their mid-40s in 1962 very often. And so one of the first things that I was told later was that my coming into the world, my being present, I had 3 older brothers, and my brothers were 18, 16, and 11 when I was born. My oldest brother went off to college, and a week later, I was born. And he comes back from Thanksgiving, and he's like, What's this? Like, who supplanted me as the most important child in the house? These kinds of things take place. And here's the thing. You're born into a context. I was born into a context in which the first way my story was told was that I was a source of anxiety. This is what I was. Because when you're 44 in 1962 and you're about to have a baby, like, people are worried. People are worried about all kinds of things that people are less worried about now. But the point was still that my parents were, there were pictures. I still see pictures. I have a photo of my parents the night before I was born, and my dad is not happy. Like, this dude was like not happy to be like about to be the father of a fourth kid. And I don't know if he was happy or not. Like, maybe the dinner wasn't sitting well with him when he had that photograph taken. Like, I don't know. But I just know that there was something about my coming into the world that was anxiety provoking. Now, can you imagine? You're going to a party and you walk in the room and you just suddenly notice that everybody just looks more anxious after you've arrived. Like, that's not a very fun feeling. And don't think for a moment that that's not going to affect you. And people are telling stories about you, worried about them. There is a lovely book called It Didn't Begin With You by a gentleman by the name of Mark Wallen, and Jay's shaking his head. You may know of this piece. And one of the things that Wallen talks about in this book is the phenomenon of epigenetics, and this notion of how generational emotional realities are passed on to the next generation and the next and the next through our genetic processing. And one of the most important things then I want to emphasize is that our story not only was told about us before we were born, but it's a story that receives the stories of others that come before us. My story is not only my story. And that brings us to the second bullet point about storytelling, and that is that all stories are always told collaboratively. Right? I was born, you were born, and then you come into the world. And the moment that you're born, you don't get to tell your story all by yourself if you want to. Like, you don't get to. Like, your parents put you in certain clothes. They put you in onesies. You would, like, I'm guessing nobody here today is wearing a onesie. I'm getting, like, you didn't not. And if you are, like, that would be interesting. But I'm just saying, these were things that parents, they put you in things. They're telling your story. Oh, doesn't he look cute in this? I would never wear that today. Oh, I think you would love to have a play date with this guy who, like, you can't stand as a 2-year-old, but you still have to go because your mothers are best friends. All kinds of ways in which our stories are told. We are sent to schools. We live in certain neighborhoods. There are ways in which our stories are told collaboratively, with other people. And over time, we acquire more and more of a voice in that storytelling venture. But here's an important thing to know. We never get to a point where we are only ever telling our stories by ourselves. Now, this is one of the most significant kind of cultural illusions with which we live. We live kind of in the shadow of 400 to 500 years of movement toward an increasingly atomistic, increasingly rationalistic way of seeing the world, right? This is modernity. This is the Enlightenment. This is the rationalist movement in which I believe that I am an individual. I can self-identify. I can do all these kinds, and I do these things. When the reality is that as far as the human brain is concerned, I never do anything by myself. I am always doing it in relationship to someone else. I am always telling my story in relationship to someone else. I think that I might want to self-identify as this and that, but it depends upon what other people are thinking. Whether I'd like to believe it or not, Someone else is always in the conversation with me. And so here's an important question. It is not, are you telling your story the way you want to tell it or not? The question is, who are the people with whom you are in conversation about what your story is? Who are the people? There will be, and some of them might not even be alive, right? My parents are still to this day talking in my ear in ways that I sometimes am glad for, and in ways and sometimes I wish they weren't. Who are the people with whom you are going to tell your story collaboratively? One of the most important things, one of the really important things about this gathering is the way in which, in coming together, we continue to each, as we have our own particular agency. And it is important to know we do have agency that belongs to only me. There is a part of my storytelling that only I can do, and I must be responsible for that. But I'm always telling it in the presence of and in light of other voices. Who are those voices going to be? Here's a third feature of storytelling: that stories are largely, not only, but largely told without language. Now, what do I mean by that? If you were to go to a movie and the lights go down, well, that's when we used to go to movie theaters. When we go to movie theaters and the lights go down, if all then that occurred was that you would suddenly begin to hear dialogue when dialogue would start to occur, but there would be no music, there would be no screen, there would be no nothing, like, you wouldn't stick around for that. So much of what makes our stories what they are amount to what we sense, what we image, and what we feel. So much that when we say that really, really good writers don't explain or tell their novels in all their detail, they show people things. Really good movie makers don't explicitly tell everything, they show things. And this is how we often operate. One of the ways in which shame shows up after a while is that we can become so well practiced at it, as it shows up in certain parts of our story, is that we don't even have to think things. So we come into a room in which we are maybe uncomfortable with the people who are there, and without even knowing it, we stand off in a corner and we cross our arms. We're not using any, I don't go and say, like, I think I'm going to go over here and stand in the corner and cross my arms. I think I'm going to go over and join that conversation, and I'm not going to say a word. I don't think those things to myself. I just do. And the story that I tell is, I don't have anything helpful to say in this conversation. That's the story but I'm not using words to tell it. So much of our story is being told without the use of language, but being told with the power of what we sense and image and feel. 60 to 90% of all human communication is nonverbal in its nature. And so imagine how much of our story that we tell to others and that we assume others are telling to us through the nonverbal features of how we communicate. Imagine all the ways that joy, but also shame, is communicated in the storytelling without the use of explicit language. One of the reasons why in our practice that we talk about it's so important for people to tell their stories more truly is that we long for them to have language that explicitly fits what the rest of them is actually saying. So much of where shame has taken root for us has been so habitual that we don't even know that it's taken up residence in the places and ways that it has in our sensations, images, and feelings, in our 7 different nonverbal cues. Becoming aware of that, observing that, being curious about that, discovering what that is, helps us tell our stories increasingly more explicitly. Here's another feature about our storytelling. We tell them in order for them to be heard. I don't tell my story just to talk. I long to be seen. I long to be felt. I long to be understood. I long to be heard. I tell my story to be heard. when there was a Broadway, if you were to go to Broadway, you wouldn't go to see Wicked just so that you could see something. You're going to see performers who want to perform for an audience. If you're going to see an actor on the stage, the actor is acting to be heard. She or he doesn't want to just speak to an empty arena. We long to have our stories be heard, and so we tell them because we assume we have listeners. And here's one of the latter features that I like to remind people of, and that is this, is that for those of us who are listening to stories being told, as the listener, you are as important a part of the telling as is the teller of the story. That as listeners, we enable stories to be told because of how we listen well. We know that stories, I mean, how many of us grew up in homes where there were certain parts of our stories that never got told? Like, for instance, I mentioned earlier, I grew up in a house where there were certain things that you just didn't name, which meant that there were certain parts of my story that I never told. I never talked about being angry at my dad. I never talked about being like exasperated with my mother and her anxiety or what felt like her sometimes controlling behavior. I didn't name those things. So there are certain parts of my story that were never told. And that is distress that I am somehow going to have to find a way to manage. And in some, some circles, we would just say, well, that's just being obedient. That's just being respectful. It's also neurobiologically work I have to do to contain distress that I'm going to have to find a way somewhere, somehow to regulate. And 8 times out of 10, we're not regulating that stuff very well, which is why we do what we do with what we call idolatry and addiction. My story was not one that I could tell very fully. I had this spiritual encounter with Jesus when I was about 13 that was absolutely life-changing for me, but within about 6 months was kind of like neck deep in what I would only later understand to be an existential crisis that probably lasted the better part of 20 years, off and on, off and on, off and on. But it was something that before I went to college, didn't probably have a single conversation with anybody about. And this is what happens when we have these things within us that we can't tell because we grow up in environments. Again, this is not throwing anybody in under the bus. Like, my parents loved me deeply. I don't have any question about that. It's equally true that I grew up in a house where my story was not actually able to be told fully because there were not ones who could listen. My mom, deeply committed Christian, I sensed her anxiety anytime I was like wandering in any way that would make her anxious. So anything that I had that had to do with doubt about the faith or wanting to date girls, like these kinds of things would make her anxious. And so we didn't talk about them. I didn't talk about them with anybody. We as listeners enable the true telling of people's stories as much as the tellers do. And so we have to ask ourselves some questions then. Given these features of stories, what does it mean for us to imagine how much of our story was being told about us long before we came into the world? And what have we done with that? What have we done not just with what our parents told about us, but our grandparents and great-grandparents and so forth? Who are the people that are telling my story with me now collaboratively? And there'll be a number of those people that I really want to be in conversation with. There may be people whose voices are intruding into the room that I wish weren't intruding into the room. What am I doing about that? What are the different ways in which I'm telling my story in which I'm not using words? I'm either not using words at all, or the nonverbal cues that I am using are telling a story that has shame in the driver's seat. My story is wanting to be heard. Who are the people who are hearing? Not just who are the people who are collaboratively telling my story with me, but who are the people who are able to listen in order for me to tell my story well. And not only that, but who are the people for whom I also am called to be a listener to enable them to tell their story well? Because here's another thing. The more able I practice enabling others to tell their story well, the more I actually tell my story more effectively as well, in addition. Now, these are just some features about how storytelling works, no matter what we think about whether there's a God or not. But I want us to consider this then, that when we think about storytelling, we think about this notion that we are not just telling a story, but we are embedded in a story. We live in a larger epic story, and we're living in that epic story, whether we think about it or not. And so here's an important question. In what story do you believe you're living? In what larger story do you believe you're living? I tell people I'd like to think that on most days, most moments of most days, I believe that I'm living in the middle of the biblical story. I want to believe that's the story that I'm living in the middle of. I'm living somewhere between the first and second coming of Jesus, somewhere in that story. But I got to tell you, by 10 o'clock most mornings, I am doing something that would convince you that that's not the story I believe I'm living in. I have already been snippy with my wife. I have, been thinking of stuff about some woman that I shouldn't be thinking about. I have been doing this. I do all kinds of things that would indicate that's not the biblical story isn't one I really believe. I don't really believe that God is good. I don't really believe God can be trusted. I don't believe that you know what I mean. It is helpful then and important for us to be conscious and paying attention to what is the story in which I'm living. And paying attention to that requires community support. I have to have other members who are reminding me. Part of why we show up on Sunday mornings for worship is that it is crucially important for us in the preaching of the word and the taking of the Eucharist and the making of confession and the worship and the prayer that we are reminded of the story in which we are living. And not just reminded, but it is reactivated, re-energized, re-imputed to us. This biblical story that began with Genesis. And we see that in the beginning, God said everything was good that he's making. All these things are good. And then he said, let's create mankind in order for them to be like us, such that not only will they be good like us, not only will they be beautiful like us, not only will they have our sense of personality and our sense of planning and our sense of anticipation of the future, but they will also create like we create. They will bear our image in the way that as we have made, so they will make beauty and goodness in the world. You were created to be known and created to be known in order to create beauty in its differentiated, linked, vulnerable relationships. We then get to Genesis chapter 2, verse 25. And the man and his wife were naked and unashamed. To create beauty in the world, we require differentiation, male and female, the different parts of the orchestra. It requires whites and blacks and Jews and Gentiles, Irish Catholics and Irish Protestants. It requires all of us in our differentiated ways. It requires us to be naked. It requires us to be vulnerable in this sense. It requires us to recognize that I am not someone who can be okay in the world by myself. I need you to cover me from danger. I need your protection. I need for us to create and to protect and guard each other's dignity together. We do this with each other. And as we do so, we do it in the absence of shame. The man and his wife were naked and unashamed. That's the beginning of our story. In the absence of shame, what new beautiful thing would you, with your differentiated brother, long to create that God is calling you to make? That's the story that we believe that we're living in. And then we get to Genesis 3 and we see what we did with it. I have a patient who's now in her 60s, but who, when she was 19, got a phone call when she was in college. When she was 19, when she was in college, got a phone call from her dad who said, "Honey, I have some news for you. I'm leaving your mother." They lived on the East Coast. "I'm leaving your mother and I'm moving to Seattle, where I have another family. Where I have another family." This man had a relationship with a woman on the West Coast with whom they had not one but two children that the family on the East Coast knew nothing about. Now, I don't know how you pull this off, but her father had been her hero. It had not been an easy marriage to her mother, but her father had been her hero. And then he said this to her. He said, "But don't worry, it's not your fault." And you see, this is a classic thing that parents do to children when they're in the middle of divorce. They tell their children it's not their fault without recognizing that, like, that kind of a message just doesn't really matter or make sense. Because a child can, like, put one and one together, and a child can look and see, gosh, if you can choose to go to Seattle, then you can choose not to be with me. And if that's the case, then what is it about me that's not enough? What is it about me that somehow you can't choose to stay? And you see, despite dad's attempt to say to the daughter, "It's not about you," the daughter's impression was that, like, I am what this is really about. If I could have done something different, you wouldn't be leaving. And we see with Adam and Eve and the serpent that even though the serpent talks with Eve a lot about God, God doesn't really want you to eat the fruit because he knows that in the day therein you will become like him. He's really telling her something also about her. He's saying to her, you're not actually enough for God to want you to become like him. That's the message that's unspoken that the writer so beautifully lets us see is going on. This is how smart evil is. It doesn't come to your door and say, "Hey, let's go rob a bank at 3:00 this afternoon." It tells you some other story and then lets you draw conclusions in isolation by yourself. And this is how the story begins to go down its more broken, sordid, painful, afflicting path. This path of isolation. In some respects, we might say it reaches its zenith when we get to John's Gospel, chapter 9, where we open with Jesus and his disciples walking, and they see a man blind from birth. This is such a beautiful chapter because this man born blind from birth, and the disciples are there, Jesus is there, and the first words out of the disciples' mouths you would think would be, "Oh my gosh, Jesus, what a beautiful opportunity. Heal this guy. We'll get it on Instagram. It's going to be awesome. What a great opportunity." No. What do they ask? Who sinned, this man or his parents, such that he was born blind? All that they were primed to do was condemn. All they were primed to do was to shame. They didn't have it within them to imagine that in this space, it wasn't condemnation that was on the way, it was glory. And what does Jesus say? Neither this man nor his parents sinned, but he was born blind, such that the works of God might be revealed in him. I want to ask this question. How many of us today imagine our own lives and our own brokenness and our own longings and our own temptation for shame to kind of get the better of us? How many of us have the practice of imagining Jesus walking into you and saying, Your experience, your blindness is what God has been waiting for forever. Your brokenness is there in order for God's good works to be revealed in you. When we read the rest of John 9, we come to see that this is not just a story about a blind man. This is a story about a blind community. This is a story about a community that turns on a blind guy. I mean, like, the blind guy didn't even have much of a choice. Jesus didn't ask him, like, could you please sign here, for patient rights and all the things that you have to sign for like informed consent. None of that. Jesus just slaps mud on his face. And the next thing you know, he says, like, go be cleaned. And he's like, I don't know where to go. I can't see. And everything then goes to hell from then on after. You see, part of the challenge is that evil will not give up, such that even in the moment of healing, even in the moments of regeneration, evil is going to do what it can to undo what God is trying to do. And so even we who live in this story of goodness and beauty that has been broken in Genesis 3, but is in Jesus being regenerated, it's important to know that evil does not want to give up its reign. And so that we see in John 9, it's not just a relational problem that we have like Adam and Eve had. It is a cultural death. We extend shame not just from within me to between me and you, but also then to entire communities that become racked with violence. Because at the end of the story, all they could do was put the blind man out of the community. But what evil didn't know was that God was not ever done with him or with us. And even then, Jesus, when he heard that he had been put out, came to find him. And I want to speak right now as we transition. We're going to go to some Q&A. I want to remind us that in our storytelling, when it feels like the community of the cacophony of voices in our head, or the cacophony of the voices that are outside of our skin that we think are trying to tell the kind of story that community in John 9 wanted to tell, I want to remind us that in the middle of all that, Jesus is coming to find us. And there's never a time when he's not doing that. When we get to this next section, we're going to talk more about how good stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And what does that end look like? And how does that help us continue every day to answer the question, what is the story in which I believe that I'm living in, and the story that I really intend to live into today? And with that, Jay, I'm going to pause and we'll go to our next set of lightning questions.
Great. Just so everybody knows where we're going from here, we'll have these lightning round questions till the top of the hour. We'll take another 5-minute break. We're going to have a guided meditation, which Curt will do with us, a final talk, and then some ongoing follow-up as we end our time together. So let's get to the questions. And if you have questions, please submit them through the chat function. I want to ask you this question, Curt, which I think is a very good question, but I want to lead up to it with an experience of mine. You probably know that people in your profession sometimes cause more harm than good. Do you ever think that? Well, I went to a therapist once, and the therapist, for my porn problem, and the therapist said to me, I don't necessarily want you to stop. I want you to stop feeling bad about it.
Mm-hmm.
I want to stop feeling shame about it. Mm-hmm. So the question is, doesn't the concept of sin promote shame? In other words, aren't we caught up in a bind that's been set up? We're told we have to high jump 6 feet. We run into the bar again and again. So what we do is we take the bar down. Mm-hmm. Isn't sin itself causing shame, or is it possible that shame is there as part of the human experience, regardless of whether we believe in sin or not?
Right. Well, this gets back to my reflection from our question in the previous section, and this appeal, I appeal to 2 Corinthians 7:10. I think the reality is that shame is a part of our experience for good reason. The question is not, is shame good or bad? The question is, what do we do in response to it? There are actions that we commit for which shame actually is the proper response. The question for all of us is, how do I respond to that? And if I understand that my life is to be lived in community, and I am sharing these things with my brothers and sisters about my life, my understanding of how I'm to respond is to be held in the context of that community. And so if I'm feeling shame, that shame may be turning me away from that behavior for good reason, and then wanting me to ask the question, but what is it that I really want? Beyond porn, as we say, and we may get to this. One thing that strikes me anytime that you see something like, this is for adult, mature audiences only, for whether it's a printed material or video material, or whatever, and except that the behavior of sexuality is actually behavior that really just wants to let me feel like I'm a 2-year-old, like I'm an infant, like I just get what I want when I want, how I want it. It's not for mature audiences. It's for extraordinarily immature audiences. This is why shame is important for us to deal with and recognize that it's not just about does it happen, but how do we respond to it?
Okay.
And so I would say to your therapist, I would say that your therapist has a misunderstanding of human anthropology.
Next question is, can you be authentic while not fully telling your whole story? And I will just piggyback on that question by say, when we see people come into the rooms of sexual addiction recovery, it is because they've tried to manage this thing on their own for years, and if not decades. And the first thing they begin to do is to tell their story, to be known.
Mm-hmm.
So can you respond to that question? Can you be authentic while not fully telling your whole story?
I am persuaded of this, that to the degree that we are actually completely transparent with God is measurable by the degree to which we are actually transparent fully with another human being or with other human beings. Now, we might like to say, I can't trust humans. I can't tell humans everything, but I can tell God everything. And I get that we can, and that God can hear that. I also know that there's a completely different kind of experience that we have. Like, I can say I trust God, and I might believe that I do. All the while, there are plenty of ways in my life that I actually don't trust him, but I'm not aware of it because I've worked so hard not to pay attention to how I'm not trusting him. I'm just not aware of it. But the moment that I am put in a position in which I can tell my story fully to someone else who is, and I don't just mean anybody, right? We're talking about in those proper conditions. The degree to which I do that, I give myself the embodied, felt, visceral sense of what it is really like to be in the room with Jesus and have Jesus hear that story and allow my brain, my neural networks, my spirit, my soul to be regenerated because the body of Christ is doing the work of Jesus in that moment. The last thing I would say to this, to be quick, is to say, it takes time to tell our stories. It is true that I can tell you some part of my story, and there might be another part that I'm not quite ready yet to tell you. There may be a part of my story that I haven't thought about for years, that only in the telling of other parts of my story is it able to be revealed. That might not come for some time. And so that's the other thing that I would say, that authenticity is something that we gradually reveal over time, over and over and over again.
Thank you, Curt. Certainly in recovery, we do our 4th and 5th steps with another human being. That's what it says, another human being. And we also have a caution in our literature. It says, until we are in recovery and sober, we do not dump our story on another in a wounding kind of way. We have to be recovered in actions before we tell our story. Here's the next question. A year ago, I confessed my decades of adultery to my wife. She sees I'm now a changed man, but my actions cause her so much pain and agony. How do you deal with shame when you see how your actions have hurt others so deeply?
So I would want to begin my answer by pausing and taking a step back and addressing the assumptions that we make about the context in which these kinds of things are taking place. When we ask our question, when we enter into that process, right? I've had decades of adultery. I'm going to tell my wife and so forth. I often have the experience, or I imagine in my mind, that this is really, I'm going to do this and I'm going to share it with my wife. And it really is then just the two of us who are now going to have to deal with this reality. And I want to suggest that the assumption that we are doing this on our own is not a biblical one. I want to suggest that a biblical way of understanding this is that I would love for that man and his wife to be telling this story, to be telling their story truly in the context of a community whose mission and purpose is to support them both, so that the wife does not feel like she's going to have to hold this information by herself, that the man and the woman together are not going to do, like the community is going to hold this marriage together. The community is going to hold him with his thing, her with her new story, the story that is true for her, but that she's only now discovering. That this is not just a function of what do we do with this stuff. It's a function of what do we as a community do with this. And I want to suggest that that changes the game completely for everybody.
Thank you. Next question. It's very important for me to understand that one of the primary purposes of shame, as you say, is to stifle creativity. In sex addiction and recovery, we often notice that temptation arises when we are bored.
Mm-hmm.
What is going on in us in boredom, and how do we counteract it? And it reminds me of the story of King David wandering around on the parapets with not much to do.
Right.
When he's hit with his temptation.
Right. I actually address this question in my book, and actually address it in light of David as well. And I suggest that, interestingly enough, boredom is an interesting phenomenon that I would suggest actually has hints of shame that are embedded in it to begin with. Case in point, your 8-year-old comes to you on a Saturday morning and says, "Dad, I'm bored." And then you say, "Well, gosh, I'm so glad you've come to tell me, because we were planning on cleaning the entire kitchen this morning. And I'm glad that you're here because we're going to find a way for you to help us clean the kitchen." And, it's really interesting how quickly the 8-year-old can find other things to do when he's suddenly like not being so bored when faced with this sense that I have to do something that I really don't want to do. Boredom, in many respects, is a function of how there is some part of us that is like, I don't just wake up bored. I grow into this place, and boredom is an outgrowth of some part of me that at that point does not feel like I am enough, have the wherewithal to do whatever it is that I can do to find my accelerator. There's something about me that in this moment of boredom is not enough. And so that's what I mean when I say it actually has some hints of shame to begin with. And then I would suggest that boredom is also a feature of our own unfinished business. I walk through this when we talk about David, in the sense that, like, when you read the story of David in his growing up years, you got to, like, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see something was not all good in the house of Jesse with David growing up, right? He gets forgotten when Jesse calls his boys in for Samuel to come. He sends David out to the front for his brothers antagonize him. David comes back from, like, his war games, and he brings the ark into the city, and he's dancing, and his wife Michal is like all over his case. Like, this is a guy who had wounds that he wasn't showing or talking about. And so our boredom becomes an extension of that. So I want to invite us to consider that anytime we're bored, the first thing I want us to do is to be curious, to say, where is the boredom coming from? What part of my own story is this reflecting? What part of my own shame is this reflecting? In what way is this suggesting that I don't have enough of what it takes right now to actually do something about it? And here's then the next thing. When I'm bored, I got to pick up the phone and like, I got to know who are my storytellers, right? Who are my collaborators? And I got to say, like, I'm going to call and say, Eddie, like, I'm bored. Like, you got to help a brother. Like, I can't just say I'm bored as if that's kind of like some static thing. This, I have to identify this as like, this is evidence that something is happening within me. And I want to more intentionally go find out what it is, so that we see boredom not as the enemy, but we see boredom as an opportunity for us to discover something new about us that God wants to bring to the surface to heal and recommission.
Okay, we have another question about the biblical story kind of overwhelming ours. This questioner doesn't understand why we need the biblical story kind of on top of ours. Doesn't it obliterate ours or distort ours? And isn't it really all about our story?
Well, I mean, let's see. I would want to make sure that I'm understanding the question clearly. When we say, "Isn't it all about our story?" I mean, I would say that, it's kind of like we like to say that all stories, um, all systems in the world are modeled after the family, whether we'd like to know it or not, right? All systems, right? Businesses, schools, whatever, they're modeled after the family. Like, you have two parents and you have children. So you have leaders and you have children that come in order, right? There's older, younger, like they have this kind of like hierarchy. And then we take this into the world. And so we might say that a child, like whether they're 2 or that they're 12 or they're 18, they might think that, like, I have my own story that's always taking place, and they're thinking, and that's true, but their story is always embedded in the story of their own family, whether they're aware of it or not. And so they have a story, but when the family decides that they're going to go to Ocean City, New Jersey for vacation, which is what our family did the last week in June every year, like, that's where that kid's going. And that kid's story, as much as they might like to think that their story is like what life's all about, like, it's actually not what life's all about. And neither are ours. And the biblical story would indicate that our story is embedded in that. And the thing about our story, I mean, this is Eve in the Garden of Eden. She wanted to take her story and separate it from God. Notice that they were given, I give you every fruit of the tree, every fruit of every fruit, I give you. But the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, she took it. She wasn't given it, she took, to separate from and to step outside of God's story. And so what I want to suggest is that my story, like, if it's all about my story and I just want it to be about my story, here's the thing. If you leave me alone with my story, I am a dead man. Because me being left alone with my story leaves me going down a rabbit hole from which there is no return. And it is only when I'm open to the story of the world as it really is, and as it really is, meaning that it is a story of beauty and brokenness and redemption, and the redemption only has one source. And if I want my story to flourish, I'm going to, at some point, have to come to terms with the reality that that story was made to be in the context of God's story. And it is God's story that comes to my rescue, not to extinguish my story, not to absorb and dissolve my story, but to actually make my story everything, the most beautiful story it could be, because it, in fact, is part of God's story. But that's only going to come on God's terms. I'd like to believe, I would love to believe that I could step outside my 9th story office window to get to my car in the parking lot as quickly as possible. That's the story that I would love, because I don't want to have to wait on the elevator. But if that's the story that I want to live in, I'm going to have trouble. I mean, I'm going to get to the ground floor pretty fast, but it's not going to be the kind of trip I want it to be, because somebody else's story is actually telling the truth about gravity. And so we have to come to terms with the reality that our story is beautiful, and as often as Tolkien and Lewis writes about so beautifully, this sense that my story becomes its most flourishing self in the context of its awakening to its place in the larger story of God.
You have about 6 minutes left for questions. I want to get to brain chemistry and the brain, because you do a lot of work with that, Curt, and we need to talk about that. Those who struggle with lust addiction are often aware that the, quote, firing and wiring mechanism has become habitual. In other words, we tend as addicts to go back and either remember in euphoric recall porn scenes that we've seen or traumatic sexual or other things that we've been through, and we find it difficult to escape those things. The more we activate it, the more easily it becomes activated, as you point out. So how do we combat this process and move more into the renewing of the mind that the Apostle Paul talks about in Romans 12?
Right. So this is all about neuroplasticity, and we could talk for a long time about this. I would say a couple things. One is that the first thing I want to say, again, back to a comment I made earlier about Jesus is not worried or exasperated about how long it's going to take us to move into this place of healing. That I am, I'm sick and I'm getting well. As I think it was when Jay, when you and I were talking, moving from I'm not bad trying to be good. I'm sick and I'm moving toward wellness. I'm moving toward wellness, and that takes a period of time. It takes a process, and so it's true that if I began my addiction behavior when I was younger, when my brain was much more plastic, they will be much more powerfully embedded in that neurobiological format. It also means that it's going to take longer, and it's going to take greater willingness to persevere and practice. It may mean that, yes, I'm going to return to those it'll be easy to return to things. And when I do, I simply come back to my cohort, my cloud of witnesses that we'll talk about here in just a moment. And I'm going to say, I'm back in that space. And we are then going to invite you to turn your brain to something else. We'll be addressing that in some way, shape, or form in this next exercise that we do, because it's not just a matter of white knuckling it. It's not just a matter of trying not to go down the old wiring paths. It is about creating new ones. And we do know that the creation of new ones over time and with practice does tend to starve those older networks. It doesn't ever kill them, because we know that you can be sober for 20 years and a certain set of extenuating circumstances can have you right back down that same old rabbit hole pretty quickly. But it is to say that the hope is in the creation of the new. And that crucifixion, as we said earlier, the Romans had lots of ways to kill people. They could have killed Jesus by beheading him. They could have executed him by archer's execution. It could have been done in 3 minutes. But crucifixion takes a long time to die. And that's what we're putting to death. We're putting shame to death and these old neural networks. Practice, 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 practice. Practicing especially being in the joy and delight of our Father frequently for short periods of time. We'll get to that in the next portion of our time. This idea that neuroplasticity changes are far more able to be envisioned and experienced when we practice small things more frequently than practicing large things less frequently. I'm going to be better at the piano, even as an adult, if I practice 15 minutes a day, 6 days a week, than if I practice for 2 hours once a day, once a week. And so I would say that this is a long road, but the important thing is not, am I going to reach perfection? The important point is, who is with me along the way? And how do they shape the way in which I don't allow shame to continue to tell the story when I'm in the process of recovery?
Okay, we have 2 minutes for this last question. Last year, Jay Stringer, who was our speaker at our men's conference, told us that he believes that much sexual acting out is the result of prior shame rather than shame produced as a result of acting out, if you follow that question.
I do.
And do you agree with that? And what do you have to say about it?
Well, I'll say this in response. In my book on shame, I invite the reader to consider what actually takes place in the conversation between the woman and the serpent in the Garden of Eden in Genesis chapter 3. It's often considered and assumed that shame only first shows up after they've eaten fruit and they then have to hide themselves from each other by covering themselves. It's true that shame does show up there. However, I want to invite, because the writing of Genesis of Genesis is so beautiful, I want to invite the reader, our audience, to consider that shame actually begins to show up relationally in the conversation where the snake and the woman are talking. And that I would suggest that the woman's taking of the fruit, in no small part, is a way for her to cope with her shame that is already emerging in the conversation. And that taking of the fruit then and the eating of it then leads to further shame, which only reinforces itself in their behavior. And so I do believe that the acting out behavior that we enter into is a way for us to cope with primal parts of us that do not believe that they are enough, don't have the felt sense that, like, I'm okay. No, I'm going to do that's what all idolatry is. And addiction in particular ways, especially as it gets wrapped around those neural networks that produce feelings of ecstasy, make them, more difficult. But it is like I would say that, I think just from the early texts, we see evidence that shame is something that evil is wielded from the very beginning.
Okay, we're going to take a 5-minute break, and we'll be back for the guided meditation.